All right, hello everybody. Today we are going to be continuing our study guide / analysis critique of Locke's second treatise of government, or on government, of government. So today we're going to be covering chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 is titled Of the Legislative, Executive, and Federative Power of the Commonwealth, and is kind of talking about how the executive and what Locke calls the federative powers stem from the legislative power and why they're needed and what other requirements there are for them. And then chapter 13 is called Of the Subordination of the Powers of the Commonwealth and talks about basically the hierarchy of different powers in the Commonwealth and what is above what. And as you can guess, legislative power is the highest. Everything else is lower than that. We'll get into more detail when we get in there. But first, let's go into chapter 12. So, the basic point that Locke starts this chapter out with is that the legislature, whatever form it might take, creates laws. But it's not true that new laws are always necessary. Therefore, the legislature will at times be in session, at times be out of session. Locke notes here, for instance, that the legislature must, when it's not in session especially, be subject to the laws in order to take care that those laws are made for the public good and not for the benefits specifically of the legislature or legislators. For example, the law permitting insider trading by the legislature is absolutely non-Lockean and tyrannical in that sense. It and laws like it enable the legislators to create laws that benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else, which is not what government is supposed to be doing, at least in the Lockean framework. So, the legislature is not always in session. When they're not in session, they should, which ideally would be most of the time, they should be subject to the laws that they write in order to make sure that they aren't basically doing things to benefit themselves and everyone else's expense. However, and so the legislature has this kind of like temporal, impermanence, right? It doesn't need to always be there. You don't always need new laws. However, Locke notes, the execution of laws does need constant attention. It can't be that, laws against fraud, even if we give up, even if we pretend that like things like murder and like aggressive violence are not on the table, we still need to be able to enforce laws against fraud, still need to be able to enforce contracts while the legislature is not in session. Therefore, the executive branch is, generally speaking, in a Lockean system, going to be a separate group than the legislators themselves. In a commonwealth, the people are one body, and that body is and so that's one group. And then in a commonwealth, the people are going to be in a state of nature with other groups and or commonwealths that happen to exist nearby. And dealing with them is what Locke refers to as the federative power. The federative powers involve interactions with those outside groups: war, peace, leagues, alliances, transactions, etc. This actually is an interesting difference from the American founders. In the American Constitution, war declaration is part of the legislative branch's tasks, as is treaty ratification. So it's interesting that Locke puts this way and says, those federative powers should be separate, probably need to be separate from the legislature. But even the American founders thought this was too much power for the executive branch to have, and therefore they cut some of those powers off and handed them to the legislature instead. Locke notes that in the same way that enforcing existing law kind of requires constant attention, federative situations are not easily handled by pre-existing law. It may be that some group that is outside of the control of the Commonwealth does something unexpected, and immediate reaction is necessary. Therefore, Locke says, executive and federal powers are typically vested in one body, because that one body needs to be around all the time, doing stuff, active, reacting to outside forces, and putting these two powers, the executive and the federative powers, into two different bodies, Locke says, has a tendency to create confusion from multiple different sources of power, applying their power to the citizens in an unorganized, uncoordinated way. Therefore, by combining the executive and federative, you end up with just one body that has a clear hierarchy, at least in a Lockean ideal, to maintain a sense of order between things that are going on internally and things that are going on between the Commonwealth and external bodies. So that's basically Chapter 12. There's not a whole lot to it. It's just kind of defining these two powers. Executive, enforcing the laws. Federative, dealing with outside forces. And saying that it's usually true that they are not the same as the legislative group. And it's usually true that they are, that executive and federative are combined so that there's not this kind of like dotted line boss situation, to put it in Scott Adams terminology. So that completes Chapter 12. Pretty short. Pretty easy. Chapter 13, of the subordination of the powers of the Commonwealth, is about hierarchy in the Commonwealth. So here's where he starts. Number 1, the legislation or the legislature is the supreme power. All other powers in the Commonwealth are subordinate to the legislature, except for the people in the act of basically replacing or reforming the legislature, the legislative branch, from their supreme power. The people retain this supreme power to remove or alter the legislature or the legislative branch if that branch happens to neglect their duties. The dissolution of government is always an option. Now, this is a problem from a voluntarist perspective, because limiting the ability of people to get away from a bad legislature and limiting that to total dissolution of the government creates a possibility or an incentive to create permanent underclasses over time. To examine like a hypothetical example, we would imagine a group of people that all get together, and they all are initially in favor of creating this government, this commonwealth, and working together. But over time, a group of a significant majority of the people, say 70%, decide that what they'd like to do is they'd like to enact policies that, while not necessarily expropriating the property of the 30%, makes the operation of things for that 30% much worse than what that 30% could make if they broke off and made their own little commonwealth. In Lockean terms, there's no ability for that 30%, since they're a minority, and deep minority, to say, well, we're out. The only thing that Locke says that can happen is that the whole government can dissolve, and that's not going to happen because, as Locke has stated, the majority, and a vast majority, really like the system where the 30% are kind of disadvantaged, and they're not winning anymore by being part of this government. This is something that is totally possible, and I would argue probably inevitable in a purely Lockean framework. And this is kind of one of the reasons why the Lockean system has a tendency to balloon out, like we have seen in, say, the U.S. Certain coalitions of little groups have created for themselves, even if you ignore all of the expropriation of property and stuff like that the government does, it still does a lot of things that make it pretty bad for a significant minority in certain cases. And, this is certainly something that is not, logically impossible in this Lockean system. And so it's something that we really have to watch out for when we're talking about Lockean systems, is that we can have these permanent underclasses as long as the only way for people to get out of a commonwealth is to dissolve the whole thing. And that, generally speaking, requires a majority, which, again, by the nature of being a permanent underclass, a permanent minority, is never going to happen. However, continuing with our summary, Locke notes that there's a possibility that there might be a unitary executive, like one guy who handles who is the top judge of all things kind of thing, except for things involving himself, right? We have to remember that that's kind of a fundamental part of Locke's system. If there is a unitary executive, then that executive is a supreme executor, but not a supreme legislator. So Locke is splitting powers up here, and he's noting that certain groupings of powers can be can be broken down, and it's surprising that he doesn't go further than he does, but he does go to at least a certain length. He notes that oaths of fealty made to this unitary executive are made in the sense of his executive duties, and in that sense only. That they don't that fealty does not extend to the executive doing things that are against the law. There is no right to obedience that the executive has, a unitary executive has, in the case that he is breaking the law or in direct contradiction of it in some significant way. This partial oath of fealty idea kind of deconvolves fealty into a variety of different types of fealty, and this is kind of interesting. Locke gives us this one little crack in the armor of allegiance, and he doesn't go very far with it, but it's important for us to note this and to maybe take it further than he did, because what this can be used for is to decentralize things that Locke didn't expect could be centralized, when in fact they can. Locke's concept of dominion is something that probably should be noted as like a partial fealty, and what that involves should be something that we examine rather than kind of push under the rug and say, well, nobody can leave once the state has dominion over this particular chunk of land. Again, this is one of those things where Locke has made these assumptions of horizontal integration that I've been ragging about over and over again, and this is finally like a piece of Locke's actual statements that say, hey, actually, there are reasons to not have complete horizontal integration of these variety of functions that are typically handled by a state. And in fact, that kind of gives us a place to stick in a wedge, maybe, and from a philosophical perspective, create a system that is, like Lockean government, but allows more freedom and less centralization than Locke foresaw as possible. So, continuing with our summary. All executive and what Locke calls ministerial powers flow down from the legislature into the executive branch, into the judicial branch. The lawmakers are, except for the people en masse, the lawmakers are the supreme power in the society. And Locke also notes that if the legislative power is also vested in one man, or is vested in one man, then that kind of necessitates a combination of legislative and executive, in that a unitary legislature, a legislature that is just one guy who makes laws, can always write new laws to execute them, as he sees fit. It's kind of logically contradictive in some sense for someone who handles all the law to only be able to handle law at certain times. Like, that would be itself a law which he could change at will. And so Locke just notes this, kind of funny logical, logical issue with unitary legislators that probably means that you shouldn't have one in the first place. He notes, for instance, that this is unless provided for in the Constitution. But if this is the supreme legislator, then he has control over the Constitution. How can he violate that? He really can't. If he does violate it, he says, well, I made a law that this is now the Constitution. This is for a unitary legislator, and this is why all the attempts to implement Lockean government have not used unitary executives and not used unitary legislatures especially. So setting that aside, because it seems to be a non-issue, for non-unitary legislatures, which is going to be most or all of them, they must be called up, elected, brought into session at times, and that responsibility falls to the executive. And here's kind of why. Generally speaking, the legislators, the people who are parts of the legislative branch, are not at work all the time. They go back to their lives and they go do whatever it is that they do in private life. And the rules that call them to order are laws. Those laws must be, created beforehand, or they must be given to the discretion of somebody. Since the executive is always at work, because laws always have to be enforced, it makes sense for the executive to have the ability to say, all right, clearly there's an issue here, we need new laws, bring them in. Or, if there is a law that says the legislature shall be in session from May 1st through August 31st of every year, then it is law for the executive to enforce on the legislators that they come in and they do their freaking jobs. This, of course, is a lot of power for the executive, and Locke notes that it's possible that an executive could possibly try to, use this power to their own advantage. If they're in a political dire straits, they deliberately avoid calling up the legislature into session, kind of thing, right? To avoid having laws being passed that they don't want to enforce. Locke notes that if the executive branch misuses this power, then what they have basically done is put themselves into a state of war with between the executive branch and the people. This is pretty strong stuff for Locke. Locke has been careful not to use this state of war point for too many things, but this apparently is one of them. If the executive usurps the power to and misuses the power to allow or enforce the legislature coming into session, that is already immediately a state of war between the people and the executive. In other words, good luck. Locke notes that the power of the executive to call legislature into session in no way makes the executive branch superior to the legislative branch. This is just a duty that it has as the enforcer of the laws. Now, I say that, but Locke's argument here is not particularly detailed. He talks a lot. He kind of talks a lot in circles, but kind of it ends up being kind of a because I say so kind of thing, which means that this is also kind of an area where I think Locke didn't think through properly necessarily the full, the way that people could interpret executive power is not necessarily 100% in congruence with how Locke wants people to interpret executive power. And so this is one of those cases where we have to kind of watch out, because this is a way for the executive to kind of claim that it has higher power than the legislature, and for a Lockean system, that must not be true. Fair enough. Further, in summary, the additional power of the executive to change or reapportion members of the legislature to deal with changes in population is something he talks about, and here he's a little weird about it. Let's see if I can find the exact quote. Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a chunky one, but here we go. Section 157. People, riches, trade, power, change their stations. Flourishing mighty cities come to ruin, and prove in times neglected desolate corners, whilst other unfrequented places grow into populous countries, filled with wealth and inhabitants, but things not always changing equally, and private interest often keeping up customs and privileges. When the reasons of them are ceased, it often comes to pass that in governments where part of the legislative consists of representatives chosen by the people, that is to say, in governments where representatives are chosen by the people to do the legislating work, that in tract of time, this representation becomes very unequal and disproportionate to the reasons it was at first established upon. To what gross absurdities the following of custom, when reason has left it, may lead, we may be satisfied when we see the bare name of a town, of which there remains not so much as the ruins, where scarce so much as housing a sheepcote, or more inhabitants than a shepherd is to be found, sends as many representatives to the grand assembly of lawmakers as a whole country, or a whole county, numerous in people and powerful in riches. So Locke is kind of saying, well, what if the law, the Constitution, states that, place A puts out 30 legislators, and place B puts out 10 legislators, right? And together they make the legislation. They make the whole legislative body. If Part A, which used to have 3/4 of the people, suddenly becomes a ghost town, and all those people move over to B, and now B has 90% of the people, that it's up to the executive in cases like this where it's not in the law, asterisk, right, to reapportion things appropriately. This is another one of those weird things that like, because I always talk about social contracts and how what people call the social contract is not really a contract, right? It can be changed unilaterally by one side of the contract without the other side's consent. It has terms in it that are vague and allow one side of the contract to expropriate property from the other side if they so please. It is permanent in the sense that there's no exit clause, that one party of the contract cannot say this is no longer, even with whatever penalties that would be reasonable for exiting this contract, this is still not worth me staying in here. Well, the terms of exit are basically death. This is why social contracts aren't. This is why a social contract in the Rousseauian sense is not really a contract. It's a slave contract. In this same sense, Locke is saying, well, if there's nothing in the law about changing apportionments, then the executive has to do it when it's necessary. It is one of those cases where if your constitution doesn't contain certain things and leaves it instead to the discretion of some other body, you have problems with the Constitution. Your Constitution must contain certain things in order to actually be a meaningful, long-term, enforceable kind of agreement. Otherwise, it probably should be, scrapped and the government dissolved and people come up with their own ideas. If things have changed so much that New York City is a desolate, empty wasteland, and Wyoming is suddenly the home of 90% of America's population, something has happened, and probably the same system that worked in one case isn't going to work in the other case, or vice versa. Basically, long story short, this ability of the executive to move apportionments around seems really dangerous, and it seems like something that he put in there as an afterthought that doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it. And the worst part, or maybe the part that we should be expecting at this point, is that Locke finishes this chapter by kind of introducing the concept of prerogative, which we're going to cover in chapter 14. And he basically says that prerogative is okay if done, quote, for the good of the people, which again is super vague language that, is a great way for a corrupt executive to drive a truck of government tyranny through. I mean, it's funny because it's with all the limitations that he's been putting on governments so far, for him to say well, if it happens, then it's good, right? That's extremely sloppy and should not be here, basically. But let's get to the very ending here. The last sentence of this chapter is something that is very interesting, and again, I think is kind of a major hole in the Lockean philosophy of government. Here we go. Quote, "Whatsoever cannot but be acknowledged to be of advantage to the society and people in general, upon just and lasting measures, will always, when done, justify itself, semicolon. And whenever the people shall choose their representatives upon just and undeniably equal measures suitable to the original frame of the government, it cannot be doubted to be the will and act of the society, whoever permitted it or caused them to do so." This is basically carte blanche for governments to do things in support of the people. And we know that this language is extremely dangerous because it's very easy to do things in support of the people that significantly damage a smaller minority within the group. This is one of those things where, if you allow governments to do this, to enrich one group, even a large majority, at the expense of a very small group, you end up with perverse incentives that create a lot of other tyrannies within the society. At the same time, it's kind of reminiscent of an old Mises quote from Human Action. Quote, "In the long run, there cannot be any such thing as an unpopular government. The fact that people are so cowed or so downtrodden that they accept tyranny is cold comfort. And Locke and even Mises in that statement are not doing a very good job of providing any kind of philosophical encouragement to people who find themselves in this unhappy position. Again, the purpose of Locke's philosophy is to create government by consent if it can be done. And if he does this enough, or if this happens enough in practice, where a Lockean style government basically says, well, the people seem to like it, so we're going to do this thing, even though it damages selectively the property of a small minority, well, then this system is not really actually consistent or stable, and probably needs to be further cut into and more powers removed from the government in order to, or more powers given to the citizens as individuals than what Locke is allowing them in this case. Again, Mises was in huge favor of laissez-faire economic policy and self-determination, but at the same time, he was, I think, trying to recognize that there are cases where people live under tyrannies and they're so deeply subjugated that they don't believe they have any chance to get out. And that's kind of cold comfort, but what are you going to do? It's not up to anybody else but those people to free themselves from a tyrannical government. And so, if they give up and just kind of accept their lot in life, then they are approving in some weak way of that government. And I think that's one of those things that we kind of have to push back against, because a lot of it comes from this kind of baked-in idea that the dominions of states can never change, or only change super rarely. And from a voluntarist, from a libertarian perspective, I think this is one of the most important things to fight against. Basically, this notion that borders are permanent, and that if you find that the government that you are working under is doing a bad job, well, you're kind of SOL, unless what you do is find another government you like better. Again, it could be that no government is to your liking, and so you've picked the one that that is best for you, but it's still really bad. In that case, there really should be some kind of an escape clause, some kind of escape hatch for people. Otherwise, you will find, a minority in every society eventually subjugated and expropriated, and that's what Locke claims to want to avoid, and he's not doing a good job of avoiding it. So, that is what I've got for this week. Chapter 14 is titled Of Prerogative. It is a 5-page chapter, roughly. Chapter 15 is Of Paternal, Political, and Despotical Power Considered Together. And that one's pretty short. That one's like a two-page chapter. We might do both, depending on how much I have to say about prerogative. Prerogative is a really dangerous concept, and I think I'm going to try to do a good job of kind of pushing back against it a little bit here, because having read this a couple of times, I think Locke is giving government a lot more power than it really deserves. So we'll see how it goes, how many notes I come up with for the next chapter. But we may do 14, 15 next, or it may just be 14. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. John Locke, Second Treatise of Government, chapters 12 and 13. Hope you enjoyed. Hope this was interesting. Hope it gave you some food for thought. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you see and you want to support the channel, you know what to do. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Have a good one.